Bon, c'est déjà ça. On a déjà Lisetta Carmi qui s'affiche.
All
Tout à
right,
l'heure,
we're
on avait
here with
Goliarda
Lisetta
Sapienza. C'est de
Carmi.
Goliarda Sapienza et de Lisetta
We
Carmi
are
que nous allons
here
parler aujourd'hui.
today with Lisetta
En
Carmi and
français,
Goliarda
ce sont
Sapienza. We're
deux
going to
femmes
speak
italiennes
in French,
qui
even
sont nées
though these
toutes
are
les deux
two
en
Italian
1924.
women, both
Donc,
born in,
c'est
both here in,
le centenaire de leur naissance. C'est
both here
Marta Gili qui
together.
est ici, qui va nous
Marta
parler de
Gili is here
Lisetta
to
Carmi. Donc, elle s'est
talk
occupée
about Lisetta
à
Carmi, who
Goliarda.
she took care
Puis,
of at
c'est
the
Francesca
School of
Todde
Art,
qui va
and Francesca
s'occuper, enfin, qui
Greggio,
s'est beaucoup occupée de
who has
Goliarda
talked a
Sapienza, qui s'est
lot
énormément
about
occupée
Goliarda
de Goliarda
Sapienza.
Sapienza et qui a fait ce livre. Je ne sais pas combien de temps ça t'a
She
demandé.
did this book.
Excusez-moi, je tutoie mes camarades parce que
Sorry,
c'est
I'm
comme si je
speaking to
vivais
you
avec elles
quite
depuis
informally.
au
It's
moins
as
un mois
though I'd
maintenant.
known you
C'est un peu comme si je les
for a
connaissais,
long
même si
time,
je ne les ai connus qu'aujourd'hui.
even though I only
Et
met them
donc ce livre, je ne
today.
sais pas combien de temps
And so
ça vous a
this
demandé, mais
book, I don't know, 7
voilà, 7
years.
ans. Et on va vous demander tout à l'heure, et
7
je demandais tout à l'heure,
years.
pourquoi tant de temps passé avec
We'll ask you
une amie que tu
why
ne
you
connaissais pas.
spent so long with a friend that you didn't know ultimately.
Quant à toi, aussi,
And
je te
now
tutoie.
you, I'm speaking to you
C'est un honneur de te
informally.
tutoyer d'ailleurs.
It's an honor to be
On va
here with
peut-être
you,
commencer par là. Bon, tout à l'heure.
Marta.
Ça, c'est le
We
travail.
might start with
C'est le
this.
travail de Francesca, on le verra tout à
This
l'heure.
is Francesca's work. We'll come to that later.
On verra tout à l'heure.
We will.
D'où
So,
est venu cet amour pour Lisette?
where
Qu'est-ce qui
did
a
this
déclenché
love
cette
for
envie d'être avec
Lisetta
elle?
come
Qu'est-ce qui a
from?
fait que tout d'un coup, elle
What
est
made you
arrivée
want
dans
to
ta
be
vie
with her?
et qui
How
fait
did
que
she
tout
come
d'un
into
coup,
your
tu es
life?
arrivée dans la sienne?
And how did you come into hers?
Bonsoir.
Well, hello, good evening, hi everybody.
Lisetta, en fait,
Right, Lisetta, she's someone that I met, that I knew. Well, I met her in Milan, at the Mia fair in Milan. Don't even remember if it was in 2017 or 2018, and I was wandering around as we do at trade shows and expos. But sometimes something just attracts you, and I saw a wall full of black and white portraits, colour portraits. I approached, I hadn't even seen that it was the Giovanni Martini Gallery stand. At that time, I started to look, and I saw Giovanni, he's here, and I said, "What is that?" And he began to tell me about that woman's story. Well, stories, plural, because this woman, we'll see this later, and she said so herself, she's lived many lives and many different ways of living. And so I said, well, I didn't know this. It's wonderful. He showed me other pictures. It was wonderful. At that time, I was a director here in Paris, but I was going to leave late 2018. I didn't have time to prepare a real exhibition in Paris as I would have liked to have done. But I became director of the National School of Photography in Arles. At this point, I thought, well, I'm going to come back to what I wanted to do and work with Lisa Coretti. Lisa Carmi. Now, I had a question. What's the first photograph that you saw? It was the travestiti, the transvestites. Giovanni was presenting this at the time in Milan. And it wasn't just one photograph. What was interesting is that Lisetta doesn't work with just one image, maybe a series, a whole report. There's also a will to tell a story, several stories at the same time. And this is why Well, there are several images. We see a mirror, a chamber, a counter chamber, a closed space where the transvestites were. There were transvestites with a chair in the road. I really like that. There were all these things. Well, this is the previous work, but we'll get back to it because we have about 400 pictures here. I'm going crazy here. I do apologize. Otherwise, you can find them in the gallery. In the gallery, there's a beautiful selection there, both in black and white and in color. Because Giovanni Martini, he's with us today, and he explained to me how he met Lisetta when he was young, and he became very close to her. And he actually spent part of his life working in the gallery, of taking care of Lisetta, her work, her pictures. We'll look at the details of this woman's many lives. She does share a lot with Goliarda, because these are two women who were really off the beaten track. This is true. This morning I was looking at a few pictures from the transvestite series, and I thought it really could have been just underneath Goliarda's house. The transsexual prostitution neighborhood in Catania. She was born in 1924, these two women were, and this was a mixed neighborhood with craftspersons and all types of commerce. She called it the Casbah of Catania. Now, it's interesting, still in Italy, I think that these places are really similar. Yes, because Lisetta Carmi was born in 1924. Goliarda Sapienza was born in Catania. These two families were really different. Lisetta Carmi came from a family that was very educated, very cultured. She studied piano. She was really spoiled up until they had to ultimately flee. Goliarda Sapienza, whereas she was very different. She was a bohemian, and not in a chic way, but in a very committed way. Maria Giudice was an extraordinary woman. She was one of the women in Italy who worked for gender equality. She was a socialist, an anarchist. She already had 7 children. Yes. Tell us more. When Maria Giudice, she was a bit of the heroine of the socialism at the time, in the 1910s, 1920s. She was 40 when she met Goliarda Sapienza's father, who was the lawyer of the poor. That's how he was known, because he tried to help poor people avoid going to prison just because they were poor. And so both of them were very committed to socialism, and the family was quite anarchical. There were always raids in the homes by fascists, because this was really the time where fascism was booming in the government. The fascist laws, yes. So the entire family was, or fascism was, paid a lot of attention to what was going on in that family. They were often spied on. They were often looking for proof to send them to prison. And Goliarda, she took her brother's name, Goliardo. He died. We're not quite sure how. We don't know whether he was killed by the fascists. We just don't know. Or by the mafia. Well, I mean, both can be linked. Yes. In Italy's history, we have seen many dangerous collusions between the secret services, the deviati, and the mafia and fascism. So it all goes hand in hand. We'll discuss that later. But Goliarda felt foreign, even down to her own name. Yes, Goliarda had issues with her name. No, it's not easy to bear a name like Goliarda. And Sapienza on top of that. Nobody had that name, so she was always wondering whether somebody else had the same name. And her brother died. It was a burden to bear for her as she bore his name. Goliarda's parents, well, gave Goliarda's name to her because, I mean, they were an atheist family. They were outside of religion, and it was a name from the Middle Ages. It was somebody who traveled. It was a sign of freedom, this name. This is, in fact, one of the main characteristics of Goliarda as a woman, being free and traveling. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I noticed throughout this research that I did on her name, I mean, it's a little like a destiny. You have Maria Giudice, the judge, Goliarda Sapienza, wisdom. Sapienza means wisdom. Angela Pellegrino, a pilgrim angel. I am like you. I really care about the meaning of words. I heard you speak in one of your interviews when you said that there was also a link to the verb. You are very into all things literary in relation to art. So I did skim through this, but in your work on Lisetta, you can really feel how you're telling the story of art. What's interesting today? Today, we are adding visibility to women's works, artist women's, not just fine arts, but writers, photographers. We have a huge range of options here. And when we see Lisetta Carmi's work, as I was saying before, Francesca, one can also think of this will for political activism and the use of public spaces. I feel very affected by certain things. The photographers, women photographers in the 1920s, the 1930s, in the Weimar Republic, I mean, between the two wars, these women used photography is an instrument of emancipation. Then in the 60s and 70s, yes, there were also women who used photography as a tool for emancipation, yes. But unlike the women in the Weimar Republic and between the two wars, they are reclaiming the public space and public presence. And it is photography, not experimentation between wars, but they use it for social activism, political activism. Almost this will that's almost naive, I mean, we all feel this way, to feel like images will change the world. I'm going to expose exclusion, forgotten identities, the invisibles, those who are suffering. Now, what I am interested in today, and Francesca is also an example. She's a young artist. She's a young woman. She looked in the archives looking for layers of meaning within history. And I'm looking for these small stories which have become a metaphor for greater stories. I can't talk about universal truths. No. We're talking about our Mediterranean basin. There's nothing universal there. But Lisetta Carmi and maybe Goliarda became a metaphor for their instruments of expression. One was photography, The other was different. Now, earlier in the previous talk, I heard a woman who said something that really struck me. She said men made photography into a tool of domination, whereas women used photography as a tool of emancipation. I wanted to tell you that because it really struck me. Because in Lisetta, in her work, obviously wanted to make the invisible more visible. She did this absolutely extraordinary work on statues. She called it eroticism and authority, yes. And Francesca, in her previous works, and in your work, in your previous works, I looked at what you did. I found Yutza amazing, breathing life into this beautiful cause. Here you can see archives that you recovered as well as photographs that you took because it made you think of her and you wanted to tell a story. Yes, I often asked myself questions on previous works and the role of the photographer, meaning that when you take a picture, what it feels like, especially when you photograph persons. I imagine that Lisetta must have asked herself the same question. When you photograph persons in their homes, what are you doing to show how they are and how they live? Are you on the other side? Are you stealing something? Are you taking away something? I worked with animals, with birds, and I often wondered about the role of the predator. They perceived me as a predator because I had that big camera lens. I was a predator to them, so I tried to put myself into their skin to avoid being perceived as a predator and to be accepted by them. It's quite strange, but I did think about it. Then with respect to Goliarda and Goliarda's mother, these are one of the few images that I constructed. Usually I tend to receive, which is another thing that I've thought about. Yes, because you are a photo editor, aren't you? Because you both did your job as an editor, but you also built something. This is a very peculiar object because even the cover is designed to be an object, like a book that might have... I mean, you have a beautiful sentence here. Yes, we imagined it already being sun damaged. The book was built together with a painter, he's the other half of the publishing house, as though it had already been sun damaged, because Angelo Pellegrino talked about Sapienza's work like a treasure that had been fished out of a work, because everything had been lost. She was already dead at the point when this work came out, and so it was in reference to that. And by the way, this treasure recovered from a shipwreck is very apt. It was posthumous work. I believe that now you know her. And in France, this person became known in Italy. This is a different woman. She wasn't a prophet within her own country, but I believe we all know her. It's as though we were given the option of getting to know Goliarda, who'd already published Lettera Aperta in 1967. She almost received the equivalent of the Goncourt Prize in Italy, and then she was forgotten. Her text is really erotic. It's very powerful. She's a woman who speaks very truthfully about sex and bodies. In Italy, were we ready to have this kind of book in 1976, 2 years about Elsa Morante's story? We should have been ready. I'm thinking of Natalie Castaniela. I'm thinking about her work in France. I'm thinking about the French publishers who advised to publish unsuccessfully. And I asked Nathalie Castagni, this was the 1970s, no, the 1980s. For 15 years she tried to publish, and in the 1970s it was normally this was the power flower time, new feminism. At the time, Lisetta was already off elsewhere. Women had more freedom than they had had in the post-war period. Well, for her, she told me that this was how it was in France. They had de Sade, but after de Sade, I mean, I think it was a literary issue. In France, people have written about the l'art de la joie, the art of joy, where they say that Sapienza's work is incestuous in terms of how she writes. I think that's it, because it's not a novel, is it? It's really difficult to categorize the book. I think that this made it difficult to publish earlier. Whereas ultimately, Lisetta, at that time, she'd already done her job. She'd done it. She had already documented many things. It was interesting what you said before in terms of how the book was received. The book was received. And I learned this from Giovanni as well as Giovanna Calvenzi, who's here. She wrote a lot about Lisetta Carmi on this book when it came out in 1962. But even the book is hidden because it wasn't in step with values at the time, with the Catholic Church, with religion in general. But then this book evolved. It became a sort of well, it's very significant in terms of photo books. It's the history of photography. That being said, in terms of big exhibitions of Lisetta Carmi, there hasn't been any in France or Spain to my knowledge. Giovanni did exhibitions, I know, but at the same time there were institutional exhibitions, apart from this last exhibition at the Palazzo Ducale. But in France there was no big institutional exhibition, something that we did try when I was in Arles. I can explain to you more. Well, I would like you to. How did you work with the students? How did they receive this queer message from this woman who'd done this work 50 years prior? Well, it wasn't just about a queer message. There was also her political commitment overall, her societal commitment. So when I arrived at the Arles school, it was late 2019, and I offered other teachers to work on an educational project with a small group of students and to work on this idea of what it means to commission an exhibition and to use archives for research. In France, this type of thing was not done very much. So we went to Gênes, to the archive, to Giovanni Martini's archive with a team of students, one other teacher and myself, to work in the archives. This was, I believe, in January 2020, February. And we were there for maybe 4 days, I don't remember, 8 or 9 of us, and we worked on this idea of how to put together an exhibition. How do we try and tell a visual story whilst providing context? But Lisetta wasn't there. She wasn't in Shen. She was working in Puglia, in the south of Italy, where she was living, where she died. And so we didn't meet the artist. He was already very elderly. We went back to Arles, and this idea was that some students would then go and meet her for an interview that would be in the catalogue. She died when she was 98, of course, yes. But then the pandemic struck. And we began to work on the exhibition. We even did the frameworks. It's a framed exhibition, and it was meant to be presented in the event Rencontre d'Arles in 2020, which was cancelled. So we did all of the work online. This is the first time that I've done an online catalogue with these publications, and all of the students were involved. It was really significant to us. I believe some students are here. Yes, Alejandro's over there, so he can testify. This person received their PhD in the Arles, and we worked with every student. We divvied up the work. We worked on the exhibition text, on the catalogue text, on the choice of images. We worked a lot with Giovanni Martini, all of this being online. We never actually saw one another, not even once. And ultimately, when the exhibition was ready, well, we couldn't present it. This is a phantom exhibition, yep. But we did publish this book. This is a special edition. And the text in there was written by some students, by Fabien Palos, who's one of the teachers. And we worked a lot on this idea of what Lisetta Carmi's work means today for young people at a master's level. And also, what do these images that are not new, what happened? How does this resonate with them? The transvestite is not the same as queer, it's not the same word. Yes, there is a terminological, well, not issue, but rather evolution. Today we wouldn't talk about transvestites, we talk about LGBTQ+. We would also talk about trans persons, transitioning persons. But we do understand what it means. And we understand this community and the gap between the public and the private space. There is this was a fine line that Lisetta belonged to in face of visibility amongst all of these men and who have made themselves visible, and then the backstage world, what happens there, what life is there. This is the same with Simonette's program, where she ultimately took these pictures. We might not see them now, but ultimately this is a critique of the bourgeoisie and how the bourgeois remain bourgeois no matter what happens. And there are these extraordinary photos with a crying father, with a tiny child embracing their mother. This is the perfect patriarchy in all of its splendor. We'll be able to see this in Castigliano. It's extraordinary.
There is a political activism, but also a search for oneself. I think it's the case for any artist everywhere. And this search is particularly strong with Lisetta Carmi. There is a quote of Lisetta. I would like to use her words. I translate it. I often felt, talking about transvestites, that they are human beings who live and suffer of all the contradictions of our society. It's not a coincidence that my emotional engagement created a trust, affection that helped me achieve this work on the basis of a work that goes beyond that of a photographer and its subject. At the time, I was tormented, maybe unconsciously, because of identity issues. Today, I understand that it was not a question of accepting a status, but refusing a role. That's something really interesting. Transvestites and my relation to them helped me accept myself for who I am, a person who lives without a role. It seemed incredible to me in the 70s, and at the same time, it's a definition not only of herself, but of her relationship to photography. And I finish. Observing transvestites helped me understand that everything which is masculine can be feminine, and vice versa. There are no compulsory behaviors except from what is imposed upon us as from our childhood. It seemed really interesting. She made photographs for 20 years. Afterwards, she did other things. You wanted to react, and I think I understand why. It's a sentence that Goliarda could have said. That I would like you to react on the role of the photographer. I heard earlier on that the photographer should be naked to photography someone who's naked. I would like you to react. I reacted that on the fact that she said not being masculine or feminine, and I also reacted on the work that I do with Goliarda Sapienza, because it's related to indistinction between men and women. It's between men and animals. It's a little bit the same. Why should we make distinctions? With Goliarda, it's interesting to see there's a sentence that she writes in The Art of Joy. It's a quote from Empedocles. It talks about antique Greece. Once I was man and woman. That's how I understand the work of Goliarda Sapienza. Probably there's the issue of the body, of sensuality, but what is even more important is the issue of metamorphosis. And that's something we can see in your book. All these metamorphoses between nature, person, body, animal. And there's something that struck me when I read it. If you want to have a look at this book and buy it, it's very well done, because you see the vis-a-vis of the photographs that you put side by side. You can see person, the body, and the sea. And there is a sentence we did manage to translate. We do not know how to translate it. It's difficult to translate, actually, how you contemplate a place, how the territory transmits something. Mimicry. You can't forget that Goliarda is 27 dives. a book is called 20 Books, 20 Dives. Very often she was writing things in the books she read. Is it possible to swim 27 times or dive 27 times in just one day? I tried and do it once, but I only managed to 15. She was a warrior. Yes, she was educated to war. When we talked about the childhood of Goliarda, I thought about she was educated to political fight. She learned boxing. She learned to shoot when she was a child, and she kept that spirit that you can do anything, win anything, and lose anything in an instant. Both these women who have nothing in common, basically, but who are very close in terms of freedom. They have several lives. Lisetta Carla was a piano player. When did she stop? Well, she was educated in music. Her family was a bourgeois family. She became a concertist. She made concerts, etc. But when she discovered photography, she stopped. People who knew her might bring some explanation there, but she was embarrassed with the idea to be in front of a public, not to be looked at as if it were an event. So she tried to switch to photography. When she took her camera, well, she did it for 20 years with a style and aesthetics which was very up to date. She understood her tool perfectly well. She had understood music very well too, I guess. And she understood very well afterwards her beliefs and the religiosity that everything which brought her to the spiritual life that changed her life completely. It's said that in general there were lots of there were a lot of demonstrations and raids from the extreme right. Yeah, the heirs of post-fascism, heirs of Mussolini. We can talk about this, but anyway, when her teacher told her, "Don't go to that demonstration, you might be hurt," you couldn't be a pianist afterwards if my hands do not serve the cause. I don't care about being a piano player. These two women launched themselves into each time. Goliarda was did different things. She's quoting Italian words which the interpreter cannot translate. Coming from that type of family during her childhood, that was it. When she moved to Rome to study drama arts, after 2 months, the city was invaded by the Nazis. So she became a partisan. Actually, the Brigata Vespri freed who became presidents in Italy. She was adored in Italy. Maybe it's the last president we liked. It was someone incredible. I watched some interviews when I was researching on the role of the father of Sapienza, and there was this interview of people who participated. What they said was difficult was that 7 people were arrested, several people from the party, and when we wanted them to go out, they had papers from Pertini because he was the only one who had the IDs. You see why we liked him. I heard this anecdote. At the end of his life, her life, sorry. So
Et donc, elle va demander une pension finalement.
She asked for a pension, for a veteran pension, and she met some guys who were laughing at her. And she said, okay, you're veterans. And she said, okay, go to the archives, and they realized she was a resistant. And she was part of resistance, and you know, and she said, go and fuck you. Is it true? You know that story, no? So there was this you have the photograph. There is a chapter in the book which is called Love. When in Italian, when you write amor, love, the other way around, it reads Roma, Rome. So she actually participated in the war. So that's the image, that's the idea with which she could wander in the city with a fake name. And her looks in that photo is quite incredible. She really ate almost nothing. She really was hungry. She was hosted with French nuns in a convent, and she was going out at night, and she participated to the partisan activities. I also thought, comparing, I made a frame there. So it was the beginning of fascism. The evolution of both these women, sensually, sexually. Sapienza is very funny when she talks about sex. She had a brief story with Milan Kundera, for instance. Do you want to talk about it? She's very funny when she talks about it. There is an interview where you can hear her voice. She had a very special voice. It was the voice of the voice of an actor, but also whispering. She was a fantastic actress in one of her life. Yes, so she was a partisan, then she was an actress, then she fell into a depression. So there is this interview, I think on Rai Historia, maybe on YouTube, where she talks about her meeting Milan Kundera. She had left Cito Maselli on the photograph there. That's when they were together. And I took a picture of him 3 years ago. He died last year. 3 years ago, I was sent to a photograph to take pictures of both the men of her life. So she was called Yutza, and he said there was a small Yutzetta that lived in his pocket. And this quote made me think about the door where they had lived in the house, where they had lived for a long time. It's a beautiful book, really. So to come back to Milan Kundera, well, she separated from Cito Maselli. For 10 years, she remained alone. She says it was the best years of her life. But she had, but some friends of her made her meet some guys. They said you need to be active, sexually active. You're going to be sick if you... She was very blunt and bold. So she met Milan Kundera. For her, he was used to very big women, etc. And she was very small, from Sicily. And her penis, his penis was far too big for her. And she tells it without any shame, really boldly. So her writing was really an issue, because only men could say such audacious things. Lisetta is very serene and calm in the way she leads her life, her sensual life. She says, you have to wash your face once with warm water and then with cold water. She lives her life in the same way. I imagine. It's a little bit like Francesca. I never met Lisetta because after the pandemic, she was very sick. It was impossible to visit her. So everything which happens with this book, the work we did with the students, well, there was a mediator, Giovanni, but there was also part of our fiction which makes that we have worked about Lisetta without Lisetta. I talked to her on the phone one day. It was her birthday, if I remember well. I don't speak very well Italian, but I understood what she said. What was interesting was that there was a sort of fiction. That's what you are creating, on a fictional memory, on a character that you have never met, that you know through books, as we know Carmi through her photographs. I talk about the students and people who were part of the project. And in the end, I asked myself, what does fiction and fiction of memory, because I suppose you worked with archive, well, there is a research, a fictional research. We look for something in the images and the literature. And in the end, both these women are a source of inspiration today. They are a source of inspiration for several reasons. But it's true that Lisetta, well, the idea I have of her about her last years, maybe last 5 years, someone who had a very spiritual, a rich spiritual life that fed her. Well, for her, photography was not something important to her. It was something from a former life, just as the piano. She did not deny it. Tell me if I'm wrong, but she was doing something else, which was maybe richer to her. Well, these women are able to recognize that it's not necessary to do always the same. If you finish something, you can do something else. To me, it's a life lesson. Change shouldn't be fearful. These women are brave. They are not afraid of changing the cape, change their desire, and to ask themselves many questions. What is interesting to me, it's the link between the two. I didn't know Goliarda Sapienza. Before this round table, it is true that there is a freedom not to be stuck to one role and to not to stick to the roles you are supposed to follow. Yes, and they fled the roles, some roles. Lisetta was lucky enough. She lived up to 100 years, so she Goliarda was afraid, I think, at the end of her life. She died in 1996, so she was 62. No, I'm sorry, she was 72 years old. She was in Gaeta. She stayed in her stairs, dead. She was separated from Angelo at the time.
Il rapporto si era affievolito. Les mots sont importants.
By the way, both of them feel guilty about her death. In all the interviews, we can see that the death of Goliarda in the stairs. They said, why weren't we there? So she died on her own. She was never afraid, even if she underwent electroshocks, trying to commit suicide. Well, at the end of her life, she became afraid. She says it in an interview 2 years before dying. I will send it. She talks about Kundera, etc. And she says, sometimes I'm afraid. And it's the first time we hear she's afraid of something. They are warriors. To be afraid is something interesting. You are totally irresponsible if you're never afraid. To be afraid is also an engine to be in your life. I don't know the circumstances of her death, but there's also a political side. We are almost at the end of our conversation. Are there questions in the room? Maybe you should ask your student what he drew. I would like to hear him about what he saw. If you agree to talk to us, you don't have to, but I would like to know what you felt. What interested me the most, was the way we could see in Lisetta someone who had several lives in one life. When we began to work, I didn't know her, and beyond her photographies, I was interested in how she had lived a long life and had become different things in her life, including photographer at one point, and how photography, and that's something that interests me particularly as a researcher, and how photography for her was a way to relate to people, and how she escaped the idea of photographer as a hunter, but as a tool to become empathic. That's what you said about the ability to go to the end of something. Giovanni, you want to add something? Giovanni has known her best. You highlighted her ability to begin a new life, to change, and always with security and never going back and looking back. And something I want to highlight is the freedom with which Lisetta lived in relation to the choice of a family. She didn't fit and didn't want to be stuck in the role her family wanted her to have. She was totally free. That's what that comes to my mind. Actually, you do not expect that from a woman. If she had been a man who changes job or other things in life, well, a woman with such a freedom is something which today is quite complex for a woman. It's also the commitment towards the others. She was generous towards life and the others in general, the part of society that she wanted to highlight, and the hidden realities that are set aside. She worked on that and wanted to bring it to light, and today more than ever her work is essential. All the invisible people are the ones we do not want to see. It's a pendulum movement. Thank you, Giovanni.
Parce que Giovanna, elle a fait ce travail extraordinaire d'écrire le livre Les 5 vite di Lisetta.
She wrote The 5 Lies of Lisetta. I had long conversations with her, and it's thanks to her that we have all these testimonies. But the source is Lisetta. It's a lively text, and it helps her know her better. Lisetta was an incredible person. I always had the impression that she was talking about people, not women or men. I'm interested, she said, I'm interested in people.
Et j'ai commencé à pas me poser des problèmes sur femme, homme. Elle a toujours travaillé tranquillement.
She always worked very calmly, and over the last years we laughed a lot because, for instance, when she was asked, why did you stop playing the piano and begin photography?
2 ou 3 fois. Elle faisait tout le temps comme
She
ça.
was always
Si
doing
elles-mêmes,
this.
ils sont
If my
pas
hands
assez importants
are
comme
not
la vie des
important
gens,
enough,
alors j'arrête de jouer du piano. Ce que
are not as important as the life of people, then I will
Et la
stop
chose
the piano.
étonnante avec la photo,
What
et
is
on parlait de ça
astonishing
hier
with
avec
photography, we were
c'était
talking
qu'elle
about
aussi,
it
elle
with
était très
Jenny,
contente
is that even
d'avoir
if
fait
she
les
was
photos
happy
et
to
d'avoir
have
pu
made so many
rencontrer des gens
photographs and
et
to have
donner la
had the
voix à
opportunity
qui
to
n'avait pas
meet
de voix,
people
qui pour elle
and
c'était la
give
chose
a
la plus
say and a
importante.
voice to
Mais en même
people
temps,
who
elle
hadn't,
n'avait aucun intérêt
well,
envers
at
la
the
photo.
same time, she was
Quand
not
elle,
interested in photograph
la
as
première fois
such.
qu'on a regardé ensemble des
Well,
tirages,
the first
elle m'a
time
montré des
we
photocopies. Elle m'a dit, tu
watched
regardes, elle est bien.
photographs,
Elle dit,
well,
ah,
they
écoute,
were
Lisette, c'est pas une
photocopies.
photo, c'est une photocopie.
And I
Elle
said,
disait,
well,
oui,
it's
mais
just
tu
a
regardes
photocopy, it's not
le
a
visage
photograph.
de la personne.
Well, have a
Et
look
en
at
même temps,
the face
elle
of
a
the person.
toujours eu
She
une,
always had, at
la
the same
capacité
time, the
d'être dans le
ability
présent,
to
d'être
be
très attentif.
in the
Elle
present,
disait
to be
beaucoup
attentive.
de blagues à propos, je ne
She
m'intéresse
was
pas. Et là, au contraire,
joking a
elle lisait les
lot.
journaux tous les jours.
She was
Elle était
reading the
très
newspapers
attentive
every
à ce qui se
day.
passait
She
dans la
wanted
presse,
to
à la
know
télé, même
about what
dans la
happened.
télé à la fin de sa vie. Elle avait ignoré
She
la
was even
télévision toute sa vie.
interested
À un
in
certain moment,
TV at the
elle a
end of her
découvert la
life.
télévision.
She
C'était
discovered
quelqu'un pour moi, c'est
television at the end of her
maîtresse.
life.
Non, je voulais
She's
encore
a
vous
master
raconter
to
une
me. I
petite
would like to
anecdote,
tell you
c'est-à-dire
an
comment elle
anecdote,
arrivait parfois
how
à la
she
photo.
managed how she managed to,
Au début
how,
des
how
années
did she go
60,
to
une
photography.
écrivain qui s'appelle
In the
Maria
beginning of the
Jacobe
60s, a writer,
publié
Mario
ses
Jacobe,
racontes d'enseignants dans les
published
écoles primaires dans un petit village de la
a
Sardaigne,
story
à Orgosolo,
about his job
ses
in
expériences
Sardinia
comme
as a
enseignant.
teacher. So
Et
his
Lisetta
experience
lisait
as a
ça
teacher.
sur cette
And
revue
Lisetta
Il
was
Mondo, une revue assez importante en
reading it
Italie.
in Il Mondo,
Et
an
dans ses
important
racontes,
review in Italy,
Maria Jacobe
magazine.
parlait du
And Maria
petit enfant,
Jacobo talked
Giovanni,
about a
qui s'appelait
child
à l'époque,
called
et qui parlait
Giovanni
avec la
who
lune
was talking to the moon,
numérique, mais aussi
but also
écrivait aussi des conditions de cette famille, de pauvreté, de cette
but he also described the
région.
living conditions, the very
un
poor
jour,
living
elle est
conditions of
partie,
the region. One
pour
day,
aller connaître cette
she
situation
went
à
there because she
Orgosolo. Elle a
wanted
frappé à la
to
porte de cette
meet
famille,
these
de cet
people,
enfant,
this
et de
family,
là a commencé tout un
and
travail incroyable en Sardaigne.
she began
C'est-à-dire
to
cette approche absolument
do something in Sardinia.
authentique, vraie,
It
seulement
was
pour
a
comprendre les choses,
truthful
pour connaître
approach.
d'une profondité la
She
réalité
wanted
qu'elle
to
voulait,
deeply
qu'elle voulait avoir.
understand the
Oui, elle
reality.
prenait à bras le corps
She
chaque jour de sa
really
vie.
completely,
En fait,
she
je
was
pense que c'est
completely
Giovanna qui l'a
committed
pris.
to
J'avais
everything
aussi
she did.
une autre citation de
I have
Carmi
another
qui renforce
quote
ça. Elle dit,
from Carmi
pour
that
moi, la
reinforces
photographie
that. For
que
me,
je perçois
photography
et je
that I
pratique
perceive
exclusivement
and
comme un
practice
reportage n'est
exclusively
pas
as
tant un moyen d'expression qu'un moyen de compréhension et de
as a
communication. Ça,
journalist
c'est
is
très
only a
intéressant parce que,
communication
en fait,
means.
d'une certaine façon,
In
bien sûr
some
qu'elle
way,
s'exprimait
of
elle-même à
course,
partir de la
she
photo, mais
expressed
elle voulait
herself
refuser
in
ce
the
côté
photographs, but
expressionniste. Je
she
pense
refused that
que la photographie
expressionist
peut nous
side.
aider
I
à
think
comprendre
photography
les
can
autres
help us
et leurs
understand the
problèmes,
others
ainsi
and their
qu'étudier ce
issues
qui pourrait être
and
fait
study
pour
what could be
atteindre le
done
bien-être
to
universel, pour briser les
reach
frontières, les barrières
a
qui
universal
séparent encore
well-being
les gens
and
et
break
pour
the barriers that
surmonter la
separate people
méfiance,
and
pour se
overcome
débarrasser des
defiance,
préjugés, pour
to
éliminer
get
les
rid of
conventions injustes qui sont
prejudices
désormais inscrites
which
dans les lois.
an
C'est un
injustice which
programme.
is now in
Voilà,
a
je
law.
pense que
What a
c'est ça,
program. This
En fait, cet idéalisme, la
this
question vraiment de
idealism
c'était central au travail des deux.
was
Et
central
c'est qui nous
in
manque un peu
both
aujourd'hui,
works,
je trouve.
and it's
Enfin, au niveau
something
historique,
that
notre
lacks
époque, c'est
today.
beaucoup moins idéaliste que la leur.
Our
Et bon, c'est un
era
peu ça
is
aussi la
less
leçon.
Mais elles sont toujours là.
idealistic.
Donc finalement,
But
c'est
they are
d'elles qu'on
there.
vous parle aujourd'hui et c'est
And we
elles
are
encore
talking
qui
about
nous
her,
éclairent,
about
la
them.
route. Donc merci infiniment, merci.
Merci.
C'était
Thank you
un
so much.
bonheur
Merci à vous.
It was
de vous parler et de vous
a
entendre.
pleasure
Merci
to hear
infiniment.
you. Thank you.